Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I ordered a mystery box of the deep web. I got the same doll my mum was playing as a kid. I've always been fascinated by the darker corners of the internet. Not in a sinister way, just curious. You know, those stories that float around about the deep web, the ones that make you wonder if there's more to the internet than just cat videos and memes. Well, that's what got me into trouble. It started a few months ago when I stumbled upon a subreddit dedicated to the deep web. Most of it was the usual, stories about buying fake IDs, bizarre services, and, of course, the infamous mystery boxes. For those who don't know, these mystery boxes are packages you can order, filled with random items. The idea is that you never know what you'll get. Sometimes it's just junk. Sometimes it's creepy stuff. And sometimes it's something worse. I read through the posts, each one more intriguing than the last. People shared pictures of what they received. Old VHS tapes with strange recordings, weird trinkets, strange dolls, even notes written in some foreign language. The more I read, the more curious I became. It wasn't just the idea of receiving something unusual. It was the thrill of the unknown. So after lurking on the subreddit for weeks, I finally worked up the nerve to dive in myself. I knew how to access the deep web safely, using a VPN, Tor browser, all the precautions you hear about, and it wasn't long before I found a site selling mystery boxes. The site was basic, like something straight out of the 90s, and the prices were ridiculously high. But the excitement overshadowed my common sense. I ordered a box. The payment method was sketchy, of course. Cryptocurrency only. I figured I'd get a box of junk, maybe something creepy that would make for a good story to tell my friends. The anticipation was a weird mix of excitement and dread. What would be inside? Was this all just a scam? After I placed the order, I immediately regretted it. What if I had just thrown away a bunch of money for nothing? What if the box never even arrived? Worse, what if it did, and there was something really messed up inside? But by that point, it was too late to turn back. The order was made, the money was gone, and all I could do was wait. A week passed with nothing, and I started to relax a bit, thinking maybe it wasn't going to arrive after all. Maybe I'd been spared. Then one Friday evening, I came home from work and found a package sitting on my doorstep. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and wrapped in brown paper. There was no return address, no markings of any kind, just my name and address scrawled on the front in messy handwriting. My heart raced as I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen table. The apartment was eerily quiet. My roommate was away for the weekend, and the sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the walls. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the package, my hands shaking slightly. What was I doing? Why was I so eager to invite something like this into my life? But curiosity got the better of me. With trembling fingers, I peeled away the brown paper, revealing a plain, unmarked cardboard box underneath. I lifted the lid, half expecting something to jump out at me, but instead, I was greeted by a layer of crumpled newspaper. I carefully removed the paper, revealing the contents inside. At first, it seemed like a random assortment of junk, a small, worn-out book, a handful of old photographs, a rusty key, and a doll. It was the doll that caught my attention first. It was an old-fashioned porcelain doll, the kind with a cracked face and faded dress. It wasn't the sort of thing you'd expect to find in a mystery box, but there was something oddly familiar about it. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The dress was a dull blue, frayed at the edges, and the porcelain was chipped in places, but the detail was remarkable, especially the eyes, which seemed to stare right through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen this doll before, maybe in a dream or a vague childhood memory. It unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. I set the doll down and turned my attention to the rest of the box. The photographs were old, yellowed at the edges. Most of them were of a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, playing in what looked like an old house. The pictures were black and white, the kind you'd expect to see in a grandparent's photo album, but there was something off about them too. The girl's face was always turned away from the camera, or blurred, as if she was moving too quickly when the picture was taken. I glanced at the book next. It was small, almost like a journal, with a leather cover that was cracked and worn. The pages inside were filled with handwriting, tight, cramped script that was hard to read. I flipped through it quickly, catching glimpses of words here and there, but nothing made sense. It seemed to be some kind of diary, though I couldn't tell whose. Then there was the key. It was old, rusty, the kind that might open a padlock or an antique chest. There was no indication of what it might unlock, and I had no intention of finding out. The whole thing felt wrong, like I was prying into someone else's life. I pushed the box aside, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. I told myself it was just some weird coincidence, a random assortment of old stuff, nothing more. But as the evening wore on, that doll kept drawing my attention. It sat on the table, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. I couldn't take my mind off it. It wasn't just the feeling that I'd seen it before. There was something more to it, something I couldn't quite place. And that's when it hit me. I had seen that doll before, in an old photo album my mom used to keep in the attic. I remember flipping through it when I was a kid, asking her about the pictures. One of them was of her as a little girl, holding a doll, the same doll that was now sitting on my kitchen table. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way it could be the same doll. It was impossible, but the resemblance was uncanny. The same cracked porcelain, the same blue dress, the same lifeless eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to call my mom right then, to ask her about it, but it was late. She'd be asleep, and besides, what would I even say? "Hey Mom, I ordered a mystery box off the deep web and got a doll that looks just like the one you had as a kid. What's that about?" No, I'd sound insane. Instead, I decided to put the doll back in the box. Out of sight, out of mind. I shoved the other items back in too. The photographs, the book, the key. Then I sealed the box and shoved it into the back of my closet, determined to forget the whole thing. But as I climbed into bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just opened a door I shouldn't have. Something about that doll, those photographs, it all felt too connected, too deliberate. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself it was just my imagination. But sleep didn't come easy that night. And when it finally did, the nightmares began. I woke up the next morning, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The remnants of the nightmare clung to my mind like fog, the details slipping away the moment I opened my eyes. All I could remember were flashes running down a dark hallway, whispers that seemed to echo all around me, and those lifeless, glassy eyes staring at me from the shadows. Shaking off the lingering unease, I tried to go about my day as usual. I pushed the box and its contents out of my mind, focusing instead on work, errands, anything that would distract me. But no matter what I did, the memory of that doll kept creeping back into my thoughts. By the time I got home that evening, I felt like I was being watched, though I was alone in the apartment. As I stepped through the front door, I was struck by how still everything was. Usually, I'd unwind by watching TV or scrolling through my phone, but that night, the silence was overwhelming. It pressed in on me, making every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, seem like something more. I forced myself to ignore the feeling, but the nagging thought wouldn't leave me alone. What if that doll was more than just a coincidence? What if it really was connected to my mom's childhood? I kept replaying the image of the photo from my mom's album, the one of her with the doll. I'd never paid much attention to it before, but now it felt like a puzzle piece that I needed to fit into place. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom's number before I could talk myself out of it. She picked up after a couple of rings, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey, honey, what's up?" she asked, sounding surprised to hear from me so late. "Hey, Mom. I've been thinking about something from your old photo albums," I started, trying to keep my voice casual. "Do you remember that doll you had when you were a kid? The one with the blue dress?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than I expected. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, more distant. "How do you remember that doll? I don't think I've ever shown you those pictures." That sent a shiver down my spine. I distinctly remembered seeing the photo as a kid, but the way she said it made me question my own memory. "No, I'm pretty sure you did. I remember asking you about it." Another pause. "Well, maybe, but that doll, it was special to me when I was little. Your grandmother made it for me, you know. I used to take it everywhere, but I lost it when I was about your age. It just disappeared one day, and we never found it." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mom's old doll went missing decades ago, and now I had one that looked just like it sitting in my closet. The coincidence was too much to ignore. "Mom, I have to tell you something," I stammered, trying to find the right words. "I found a doll that looks exactly like the one in your pictures. It came in this box I bought online, and I can't stop thinking that it's somehow the same one." For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's not possible. The doll was lost for years. It can't be the same one." I know, but it's so similar, Mom. It even has the same crack on its face." A sharp intake of breath. "Are you sure it's cracked in the same place?" "Positive." There was a long silence, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in my mom's head, trying to process what I was telling her. When she finally spoke, her voice was tinged with fear. "Listen, honey, I need you to do something for me. Take that doll and get rid of it. Right now. Don't think about it. Just do it. Promise me." Her sudden urgency sent a wave of panic through me. "What? Why? It's just an old doll, right?" "I can't explain it over the phone. Just please, trust me. Get rid of it, and don't bring it back into your home." The fear in her voice was contagious, and I found myself nodding, even though she couldn't see me. "Okay, I'll get rid of it." We ended the call, and I was left standing in my kitchen, my heart racing. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was in the middle of some horror movie plot. But this was real, and the fear in my mom's voice was real too. I knew I couldn't keep the doll in my apartment, not after that conversation. But as I walked toward the closet where I'd hidden the box, a cold dread settled in my gut. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, like the space around me was pressing down on my chest. When I finally opened the closet door, the box was exactly where I'd left it, untouched, but it felt wrong somehow, like the doll inside knew what I was about to do. I steeled myself and grabbed the box, carrying it outside as quickly as I could. There was an old dumpster in the alley behind my apartment building. It seemed like the best place to get rid of something I didn't want to be found again. I yanked the lid off the dumpster, the rusty hinges creaking in protest, and tossed the box inside without a second thought. The thud it made when it hit the bottom was oddly satisfying, like I'd just gotten rid of a burden I didn't even know I was carrying. But as I turned to head back inside, something stopped me. It was like a whisper in the back of my mind, a nagging feeling that I hadn't really solved anything, that getting rid of the doll wasn't going to be that simple. I tried to push the thought away, chalking it up to nerves, but deep down, I knew that whatever I'd brought into my life wasn't going to let go so easily. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the apartment making my pulse quicken. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of those photographs, of the little girl with her face turned away, and the way the doll's eyes seemed to follow me no matter where I was in the room. And then there was the dream. Or was it a dream? I couldn't be sure. I was lying in bed, just like I was now, staring at the ceiling, when I heard something, a soft rustling sound, like someone moving through the apartment. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, frozen in place. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could swear it was right outside my bedroom door. Then silence. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. I strained my ears, waiting for some sign of what was happening. And then, ever so faintly, I heard it. A child's voice, humming a soft, haunting melody. The same tune that had played in the background of my dreams the night before. I bolted upright in bed, my breath coming in short gasps. The apartment was dark and silent, but the eerie feeling clung to me. I stumbled out of bed, flicking on every light in the apartment, searching for any sign that I wasn't alone, but there was nothing. No one. Eventually, I convinced myself it had just been my imagination, a product of the stress and the fear I'd been feeling. But as I crawled back into bed, one thought kept nagging at me, refusing to let go. The box was gone, but I hadn't seen the doll inside when I threw it out, and that meant it could still be here somewhere, waiting for me to find it. The next morning, the unease hadn't faded. If anything, it had only gotten worse. My apartment, usually a place of comfort, now felt hostile, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I went about my morning routine on autopilot, trying to shake off the events of the night before, but every shadow seemed a little darker, every sound a little sharper. I couldn't get that humming out of my head. It echoed in my mind, that soft, eerie tune I was sure I'd heard before. But where? I couldn't place it, and that bothered me more than anything else. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a puzzle I couldn't solve. By midday, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to get out of the apartment. I grabbed my keys and headed out, not caring where I was going, just needing to be anywhere else. As I walked, I found myself heading toward my mom's house. I wasn't even thinking about it. My feet just seemed to take me there on their own. Her place was only a 20-minute drive away, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever happened. As I pulled into the driveway, a part of me felt like I was being irrational. Maybe I was overreacting, letting my imagination run wild. But I needed answers, and I was hoping my mum could give them to me. She was surprised to see me when she opened the door. "Honey, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, everything's fine. I just wanted to talk to you about that doll." Her face tightened at the mention of it, and she stepped aside, letting me in. "I told you to get rid of it." "I did," I said, following her into the living room. "But I need to know more about the doll, about what happened to it." She sighed, sitting down on the couch. "I don't know what to tell you. It was just a doll, something my mom made for me when I was little. I loved it, carried it with me everywhere, but one day it disappeared. We searched the whole house, but it was like it vanished into thin air." "And you never found it?" She shook her head. "No, never. It was like it was just gone." I sat down beside her, my mind racing. "Mom, this is going to sound crazy, but I think the doll in that box is the same one you lost. It looks identical, even the crack on its face." She looked at me, her eyes filled with concern. "I believe you, but that's what scares me." "Why?" I pressed, my heart pounding. "Because," she said, her voice trembling, "there was always something strange about that doll. Even when I was a kid, I felt like it wasn't just a toy. It felt alive, somehow. My mom used to say it was just my imagination, but I'd swear it would move when I wasn't looking. Little things. Its head turned a different way, its arms in a different position, but I never saw it move. It was just different." A chill ran down my spine. The idea of a doll moving on its own wasn't just something out of a horror movie. It was something my mom had actually experienced. And now, that same doll was somehow back in my life. "Do you think it's dangerous?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know that when it disappeared, it felt like a weight had been lifted off me. Like I was finally free of it. That's why I wanted you to get rid of it. I didn't want it to have any hold over you." I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. I threw it out, but I didn't see it when I did. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when I threw the box into the dumpster, I didn't check if the doll was inside. It could still be somewhere." My mom's face went pale. "You have to find it, and you have to destroy it." I knew she was right, but the thought of going back to that dumpster made my skin crawl. Still, I couldn't leave it out there, waiting for someone else to find. I had to make sure it was gone for good. I left my mom's house with a pit in my stomach, my thoughts racing. As I drove back to my apartment, every instinct in me screamed to just keep driving, to get as far away from that doll as possible. But I knew I couldn't. I couldn't leave this unfinished. When I got back, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. I parked the car and headed straight for the alley, my heart pounding in my chest. The dumpster was just as I had left it, its lid closed tight. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and lifted the lid. The smell hit me first, the rank odor of rotting garbage, but I forced myself to look inside. The box was still there, crumpled and dirty, but intact. I reached in, hesitating for only a moment before pulling it out. It was lighter than I remembered, almost too light. With trembling hands, I opened it, half expecting the doll to jump out at me, but the box was empty. My heart sank. I'd thrown the box out, thinking I was getting rid of the doll, but it wasn't inside, and that meant it was still out there, somewhere. I closed the lid of the dumpster and backed away, my mind racing. Where could it be? Had it fallen out on the way to the dumpster? Or worse, had it moved on its own? As I turned to head back to my apartment, something caught my eye. A small figure, standing at the far end of the alley, half hidden in the shadows. It was too dark to see clearly, but there was no mistaking it. The doll was standing there, watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was impossible. There was no way it could be standing there on its own, but it was, and it was staring right at me with those lifeless, glassy eyes. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The doll didn't move either. It just stood there, like it was waiting for something. Finally, I broke free of my paralysis and turned, running back to my apartment as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and sliding the deadbolt into place. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I backed away from the door. I could still feel its eyes on me, even though I knew it couldn't possibly be there. But the worst part was the realization that came crashing down on me as I stood there, gasping for breath. The doll wasn't just some random object. It wasn't just a toy. It was something much darker, something much older, and somehow it had found its way back into my life. And now, it wasn't just a doll. It was a memory, one I couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat up in bed, every light in the apartment on, listening for any sound, any sign that it was still out there, watching me. The hours ticked by, and the storm outside grew louder, the wind howling through the trees, the rain pounding against the windows. But inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses down on you, suffocating until you can't think straight. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder if you're really alone, or if something is lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as I sat there staring at the door, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I hadn't closed the closet door after I took the box out. The realization hit me like a freight train, sending a cold wave of dread crashing over me. I hadn't closed the closet door. The thought of that dark, gaping space behind me, open and waiting, made my skin crawl. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body felt like it was made of lead, every muscle locked in place by the sheer weight of terror. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if the howling wind and rain were trying to drown out the silence inside the apartment. But I couldn't ignore it. The nagging feeling that something was wrong, that something was there. I forced myself to turn around, my breath catching in my throat as I did. The hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the bedside lamp, and there, at the end of it, was the closet door, ajar just enough to show the darkness inside. It was so still, so quiet, that for a moment I wondered if I was imagining it. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. The door had been closed. When I left, I was sure of it. And now, it wasn't. I knew I had to check. I couldn't just sit there, frozen in fear, letting my imagination run wild. I had to see for myself, had to know if something or someone was in there. I stood up slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop, to turn back, to run. But I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, until I was standing in the hallway, just a few feet away from the closet. The door creaked as I reached out to push it open, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. I hesitated, my hand trembling, before finally shoving the door wide open. Darkness. Just darkness. The closet was empty, just as I'd left it. The box was gone, the shelves bare, but there was something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. On the floor, in the very back of the closet, was a small dark stain. It was barely noticeable, blending into the shadows, but it was there. I knelt down, squinting in the dim light, and touched it with my fingers. It was wet. I recoiled, wiping my hand on my jeans, my mind racing. The stain wasn't big, but it was fresh, and it definitely wasn't there before. Suddenly, a thought occurred to me, something I hadn't considered in my panic. The doll wasn't in the box when I threw it out, but that didn't mean it was gone. What if it had moved? What if it was still in the apartment, hiding, waiting? I stood up quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had to find it. I couldn't just leave it somewhere in the apartment, lurking in the shadows, ready to reappear when I least expected it. I had to know where it was, had to get rid of it for good. The thought of searching the apartment made my stomach turn, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that if I didn't find it, something worse would happen. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and started my search, sweeping the beam across every corner, every darkened nook and cranny. I checked the living room first, under the couch, behind the curtains, anywhere a small object could be hiding. Nothing. The bathroom was next, the cold tile floor making my skin prickle as I checked under the sink, behind the shower curtain. Again, nothing. By the time I made it to my bedroom, my nerves were frayed, every creak and groan of the apartment making me jump. The flashlight flickered as I entered the room, casting long shadows on the walls. I checked under the bed, in the dresser drawers, even in the nightstand. Still nothing. But when I reached the closet in my bedroom, the one where I kept my clothes, my shoes, the one I use every day, my heart nearly stopped. There, sitting on the floor in the center of the closet, was the doll. It was exactly as I'd last seen it. The same cracked porcelain face, the same faded blue dress, the same lifeless eyes. But now, up close, I could see something I hadn't noticed before. The crack in its face had spread, spiderwebbing out from the original fracture, and from within the crack, something dark was seeping out. I stared at it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The dark stain on the floor, the wetness, it was coming from the doll. I had to destroy it. I didn't care what it took. I just knew that I couldn't let it stay in my apartment any longer. I grabbed a towel from the closet, wrapping the doll in it, the porcelain cold and unyielding against my skin. The dark liquid seeped through the towel, staining it almost immediately, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I carried the doll out to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it, but I managed to steady myself, laying the doll on the counter. The towel was soaked now, the dark stain spreading, but I forced myself to ignore it. I raised the knife, aiming for the doll's chest, and brought it down with all the force I could muster. The blade shattered the porcelain with a sickening crack, the sound echoing through the apartment like a gunshot. But as the doll broke open, what I saw inside made my blood run cold. There, nestled within the shards of broken porcelain, was a heart. A small, shriveled, blackened heart, beating faintly, its surface slick with the dark liquid that had been seeping through the cracks. It pulsed weakly, as if it was alive, but only just. I dropped the knife, stumbling back in horror. This wasn't just a doll. It was something else entirely, something alive, something that had been waiting inside, hidden behind the porcelain, all this time. The heart gave one last feeble beat before it stopped, the dark liquid oozing out and pooling on the counter. I watched in numb shock as the life drained out of it, the once faint rhythm fading into nothing. It was over. Whatever had been inside the doll, whatever dark force had been lurking there, was gone. But as I stood there, staring at the shattered remains on the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, that whatever had brought the doll into my life wasn't done with me yet. I gathered the pieces, careful not to touch the heart, and threw them into a garbage bag. The weight of the doll, now just a pile of broken porcelain and dark liquid, felt heavier than it should have. I tied the bag shut, sealing it as tightly as I could, and took it outside, far from the apartment, to the dumpster at the edge of the complex. As I stood there, watching the bag disappear into the trash, a part of me wanted to believe that it was over, that I had finally rid myself of whatever curse or spirit or evil had been attached to that doll. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. As I walked back to my apartment, the wind howling around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that even though the doll was gone, its presence lingered, just out of sight, waiting. That night, I slept with the lights on, the bedroom door locked. I told myself it was just a precaution, that I was being paranoid, but the truth was, I didn't feel safe. Not in my apartment, not anywhere, not anymore. The dreams came again, more vivid, more terrifying than before. The dark hallway, the whispers, the feeling of being chased. But this time, the doll was there too, standing at the end of the hallway, its cracked face twisted into something almost human, something almost alive. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, sweat dripping down my face. The apartment was quiet. The storm had passed, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. And that's when I heard it, a soft, familiar humming drifting through the apartment, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. The same haunting melody that had echoed in my dreams, that had followed me since I found the doll. Only this time, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. The humming grew louder, filling the apartment with an eerie, childlike tune that made my skin crawl. It was coming from the living room, just beyond my bedroom door. And as much as I wanted to stay hidden under the covers, I knew I couldn't. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to leave me alone. I slipped out of bed, moving as quietly as I could, every instinct telling me to run, but there was nowhere to go. My hands were trembling as I reached for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of the humming, so soft and innocent, belied the terror it stirred within me. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of the lamp I'd left on, but it was empty. The humming, however, was louder now, more insistent, coming from just beyond the room. It sounded like a child, lost in some haunting lullaby, and as much as I didn't want to find the source, I knew I had to. I took a step forward, and then another, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The sound was leading me toward the front door, as if whatever was humming wanted me to follow. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them comforting. Was this the doll, or something else entirely? Was I losing my mind? As I reached the living room, the humming stopped abruptly, leaving the apartment in a silence so thick it was suffocating. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the oppressive quiet. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The front door was ajar, just a crack, but enough for a thin sliver of darkness to spill into the room. I hadn't touched the door. I knew I hadn't, and yet, here it was, open as if inviting me to step outside. I moved toward it, my breath shallow, my pulse thudding in my ears. My hand reached for the doorknob, and as I pulled the door open wider, I saw it, a small shadowy figure, standing just outside, bathed in the dim light of the hallway. The figure was holding something, clutching it tightly to its chest. The doll. It was standing there, just outside my apartment, as if waiting for me. But this time, it wasn't alone. The small blackened heart I had seen before was gone, replaced by a new, larger crack running down its face. From within the crack, something was moving, writhing as if trying to escape. I recoiled, fear gripping me like a vice. The figure holding the doll was no more than a shadow, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. But I could see its eyes glowing faintly, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, holding the doll, its grip tightening until I could hear the faint sound of porcelain cracking under the pressure. Then the humming started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the figure or the doll. It was coming from behind me, from inside the apartment. I spun around, my heart lurching in my chest, and saw something that made me want to scream. The doll was inside the apartment, sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, perfectly still, its glassy eyes fixed on me. But that wasn't possible. I had just seen it outside, held by the shadowy figure. How could it be here too? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it was like trying to piece together a nightmare that refused to end. The shadowy figure at the door, the doll in the living room, the humming that filled the air. It was all too much. And then, as if sensing my fear, the doll inside the apartment began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head toward me, the crack in its face widening, the darkness within it spreading like ink. I could see something inside, something shifting and pulsating, as if it was alive. I backed away, my legs shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The doll outside was still there, but now it was joined by others, more shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, each one holding a doll of their own. Their eyes, faintly glowing, all turned toward me, and the humming grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. I knew I had to get out, had to escape, but the apartment felt like a trap, the walls closing in on me. I turned back to the hallway, ready to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, as the doll inside the apartment rose to its feet. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls warping and twisting as the figures outside moved closer, their eyes glowing brighter. The air grew thick with the scent of something rotten, and I could feel a cold, clammy hand brush against my arm, but no one was there. The doll took a step toward me, its movement slow and deliberate, like a puppet on invisible strings. The crack in its face widened even more, and from within, I saw something emerge, something small, dark, and covered in what looked like writhing tendrils. It slithered out of the doll's face, dropping to the floor with a wet, sickening sound. The humming reached a crescendo, the sound drilling into my skull, and I realized, with a sickening dread, that it was coming from the dolls themselves. They were all humming, their voices high and childlike, singing the same haunting melody that had haunted my dreams. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the confusion, the sheer horror of what was happening. It was too much. I turned and ran, my feet finally obeying me, sprinting down the hallway toward the back door. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was far away from this nightmare. I reached the door and yanked it open, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I stumbled outside, gasping for breath, but the humming followed me, growing louder and louder, as if the dolls were right behind me. I ran, not daring to look back, the wind whipping through my hair, the night swallowing me whole. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care, as long as I could get away from those things, those figures that weren't quite human, those dolls that weren't just toys. The world around me blurred, my vision clouded by tears of terror, until finally I collapsed on the side of the road, my body giving out. I lay there, gasping for breath, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no sense to it. There was no logic, no reason, just a deep, unrelenting horror that had wormed its way into my life and refused to let go. And as I lay there, the wind howling through the trees, I heard it again. The humming, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was following me, echoing through the night, a reminder that no matter how far I ran, I could never escape. I didn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't. I left everything behind. My things, my life, my past. I moved to a new town, changed my number, even my name, hoping to outrun whatever curse or spirit or nightmare had attached itself to me. But the humming never stopped. Sometimes it's faint, like a whisper at the edge of my hearing, just enough to remind me that it's still there. Other times it's louder, more insistent, like it's trying to draw me back, trying to pull me into the darkness. I know now that it's not just the doll. It's something older, something darker, something that's been watching me, waiting for me, for a long, long time, and it won't stop, not until it gets what it wants. I still see the doll sometimes, in the shadows, in my dreams, in the corners of my vision. It's always there, watching, waiting, the crack in its face widening, the darkness inside growing, and the figures, there with it too, always there, just out of sight, just beyond the light, waiting for the right moment to step forward. I've tried to outrun it, tried to forget, tried to move on, but the truth is, I can't. Because it's not just a memory. It's a part of me now, and no matter where I go, no matter what I do, it will always find me. And the humming, that soft, haunting lullaby, will never stop. I found a game on the dark web that lead me to abandoned mansion. You won't believe what I found there. Alright, so let me start by saying I'm not usually the type to go exploring the dark corners of the internet. Like most people, I've heard the stories, both the ridiculous and the genuinely terrifying, and I've always been content with the surface web. But like all good stories, this one starts with a dumb decision, born out of curiosity and boredom. A couple of months ago, I was stuck in a rut. Same old job, same old routine, same old everything. I'd come home, grab a beer, and just scroll mindlessly through Reddit or watch random YouTube videos until I passed out on the couch. I don't know what exactly drove me to dive deeper that night. Maybe it was the six-pack. Maybe it was the thrill of doing something I shouldn't. But somehow, I ended up on a forum discussing the hidden gems of the dark web. I know what you're thinking. And yeah, it was stupid. But when you've spent the last few months on autopilot, Even the smallest hint of danger feels like a rush. The forum was pretty much what you'd expect. People boasting about finding weird sites, cryptic puzzles, or the occasional link to some shady marketplace. But then, someone mentioned something that caught my attention. Ever heard of Nocturne? One user had posted. It's a game, but not the kind you're thinking of. More like an experience. You find it, you play it, and if you're lucky, you get to see what's real. It was vague enough to pique my interest, so I kept scrolling through the thread. People were talking about how hard it was to find, how some had tried for weeks without success, but those who did find it, well, they weren't very forthcoming with the details. Just cryptic remarks like, "It's not what you think," and "Be careful what you wish for." My curiosity was officially hooked. I spent the next few nights doing some digging. Nothing too deep, just skimming through various dark web directories, avoiding anything that seemed too sketchy. But I couldn't find anything about Nocturne. I was about to give up when one night I got a message from an anonymous user. "Looking for Nocturne?" was all it said. My heart jumped into my throat. I knew I should just ignore it, but it felt like I'd come too far to back out now. I replied, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Yeah, just curious. Heard it's an interesting game." The response came almost immediately. "It's more than a game. If you're serious, here's where you start." Attached was a link. Now, this is where any sane person would have stopped. But like I said, I wasn't in the best headspace, and the thrill of the unknown was too strong. I clicked the link. It took me to a black page with a single line of text in the center. "Nocturne awaits." Below it was a prompt to enter my email address. I hesitated, but only for a moment before typing it in. What's the worst that could happen, right? After I hit enter, the screen went blank. For a moment, I thought it was just a dead link, but then the screen flickered and a download started automatically. It was a small file, just a few megabytes, named nocturne.exe. I hovered my mouse over it, debating whether or not to open it. But again, my curiosity got the better of me. I double-clicked the file. My screen went black, and I sat there staring at my reflection in the monitor. I felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread. Then words began to appear, slowly, as if someone was typing them out in real time. "Welcome to Nocturne. Do you wish to continue?" Below it were two options, yes or no. I moved the mouse to click yes, but stopped myself. Was I really going to go through with this? Something deep in my gut told me to stop, but I pushed that feeling down. I'd already come this far. What's the harm in seeing where it goes? I clicked yes. The screen went black again, but this time, soft ambient music started playing, low, droning, almost like a distant hum. It was oddly soothing, yet unsettling at the same time. Then the screen filled with images, old black and white photos of buildings, forests, empty streets, each one flickering by so fast I could barely make them out, but I recognized one of them. It was an old, abandoned mansion. I couldn't tell you how or why I recognized it, but something about it felt familiar, like I'd seen it before in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The images continued to flash by, each one faster than the last, until they stopped abruptly. The screen was now showing a map, a top-down view of a forest with a single red dot in the center. The mansion was there too, marked on the map. The red dot was moving, slowly but steadily, towards it. Then more text appeared on the screen. "Find it. Discover the truth." I leaned back in my chair. feeling a cold sweat on the back of my neck. This was getting too real, too fast. But before I could close the window, another line of text appeared. "We're waiting for you." My mouse froze, refusing to move no matter how hard I tried. The screen started to glitch, the music distorting into a low, almost inhuman growl. I tried to force close the program, but nothing worked. My computer was locked, and all I could do was watch as the map zoomed in closer to the mansion. Then, without warning, the program shut down, and my screen returned to normal. Everything was just as it had been before I clicked the link, except for one thing. My desktop wallpaper had changed. It was now a high-resolution image of the same mansion, the one from the game, and there was an address written in the corner, an address that wasn't too far from where I lived. I don't know what possessed me to do what I did next, but before I even realized it, I was in my car, driving towards the location. Something about this whole thing had me in a trance. I wasn't thinking straight. It was like the game had reached out and grabbed hold of me, pulling me into whatever twisted reality it had created. As I got closer, the roads became more and more desolate. No streetlights, no houses, just empty stretches of road surrounded by thick, looming trees. I kept driving, following the directions on my phone, until finally I arrived at a rusted gate, partially covered in overgrown vines. Beyond the gate, I could see it, the mansion. It was just like the photo, maybe even more decayed in real life. The windows were dark, the paint was peeling, and the front door hung off its hinges. Everything about it screamed, "Stay away," but I couldn't. The pull was too strong. I parked the car and walked towards the gate, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the gate open with a loud creak, and as soon as I stepped inside, the gate slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed through the trees, and I swear I heard someone, whisper my name. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. I stood frozen in place, the echo of my name lingering in the air like a ghostly whisper. The gate had shut behind me with such force that it rattled the entire fence. But when I turned to look, it was perfectly still, as if it hadn't moved at all. My mind raced, screaming at me to turn back, to get in my car and leave this place far behind. But my body didn't move. It felt like I was being pulled forward, deeper into whatever trap I had willingly stepped into. The mansion loomed ahead of me, more menacing now that I was close enough to see the details. The windows, once dark voids in the photo, now seemed to watch me with an unsettling intensity. The front door, barely hanging on its hinges, swayed gently in the night breeze, creaking softly, almost invitingly. Everything about the place was wrong, but I felt compelled to continue. As I approached the steps leading up to the front door, I noticed something strange. The ground beneath my feet was covered in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed, except for the faint outlines of footprints leading from the gate to the door. They weren't mine. The realization sent a chill down my spine. Someone else had been here recently, and they had walked the same path I was now following. Against every ounce of self-preservation I had left, I ascended the steps. Each one groaned under my weight, as if protesting my presence. When I reached the top, I hesitated, staring at the door. It was old, the wood warped and cracked, but something about it made me think it hadn't been opened in years. I pushed it gently, and it swung inward with a low moan, revealing a hallway shrouded in darkness. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, mixed with something else, something metallic, like rust or old blood. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath me, the sound amplified by the silence that pressed in from all sides. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, but I knew there was no turning back now. The hallway stretched on into the darkness, lined with doors that seemed to disappear into the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was lurking just out of sight. My phone's flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls as I made my way deeper into the mansion. I passed several rooms, each one filled with dusty, rotting furniture and long-forgotten belongings. It was as if the people who once lived here had left in a hurry, abandoning everything as it was. In one room, I saw a child's doll lying on the floor, its porcelain face cracked and staring up at me with empty eyes. I quickly moved on, not wanting to linger in that room any longer than necessary. The further I went, the more the house seemed to come alive around me. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the walls seemed to close in, as if the house itself was aware of my presence. I could hear things moving in the dark, soft, scuttling sounds that sent my heart racing, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Eventually, I reached a door at the end of the hallway that was different from the others. It was larger, more ornate, with strange symbols carved into the wood. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, and for a moment I hesitated. Something deep inside me was screaming not to open it, that whatever was behind this door was something I wasn't meant to see. But I had come this far, and there was no going back. I twisted the handle and pushed the door open. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. The room was large, much larger than it should have been, given the size of the mansion from the outside. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and dusty trinkets, and in the center of the room stood a table. On the table was an old computer, the monitor flickering with static. The soft, ambient music from the game was playing again, but it was distorted, warped beyond recognition. My eyes were drawn to the corner of the room where a figure stood, facing the wall. They were completely still, their back to me, dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in another century. I couldn't make out any details in the dim light, but the presence of another person, if that's what it was, froze me in place. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if they were waiting for something or someone. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. All I could do was stare at the figure, waiting for them to turn around. And then they did. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if they knew I was watching. When they finally faced me, I felt my heart stop. There was no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where one should have been. It was like staring at a mannequin, but I knew this was no mannequin. This was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. The figure began to move towards me, its steps slow and deliberate. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But no matter how fast I tried to move, it kept pace, closing the distance between us inch by inch. I could feel the cold radiating off it, seeping into my bones, chilling me to the core. In a desperate attempt to escape, I turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop to look back, didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. The hallway seemed longer now, the doors on either side blurred and distorted as I ran past them. The house was alive with noise, the creaking and groaning of the floorboards now deafening, the walls vibrating as if they were going to collapse. I finally reached the front door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop. I ran down the steps across the lawn and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and throw myself inside. I didn't look back as I sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. The road was dark, the trees pressing in on either side, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just seen, but there was no making sense of it. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat in the car for what felt like hours, trying to calm my racing heart. The night was eerily silent, the events of the evening playing over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of that faceless figure, of the cold, empty eyes that had stared back at me. But the most disturbing part, as I sat there in the darkness, trying to convince myself that it was all some sick hallucination, my phone buzzed. A single message lit up the screen. "Welcome to Nocturne. You've only just begun." I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around my heart as I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. I didn't sleep that night. After the message appeared on my phone, I just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to convince myself that it was some sort of elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Everything I had experienced felt too real, too visceral to be a joke. Eventually, the adrenaline faded and exhaustion took over. I stumbled into my apartment, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the couch. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. Who or what had sent that message? And what did they mean by only just begun? I must have dozed off at some point, because when I woke up, it was morning. The pale light of dawn was creeping through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a vivid, terrifying nightmare. But then I saw my phone lying on the coffee table, the screen still displaying the message. I deleted it immediately, hoping that would somehow erase the events of the night before. But the unease lingered, a gnawing sense of dread that wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I decided to try and distract myself, to go about my day as normally as possible. I showered, made coffee, and sat down at my computer to do some work. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the mansion, to the faceless figure, and the ominous message. I needed answers, but I had no idea where to start. The dark web forum where I had first learned about Nocturne was gone. I tried searching for it again, but it was like it had never existed. The link, the messages, even the file. I couldn't find any trace of them. It was as if they had been wiped from existence, leaving me with nothing but questions. Days passed, and I did my best to move on, to forget about the whole thing, but the strange occurrences didn't stop. It started small. Items in my apartment would be slightly out of place. Doors that I was sure I had closed would be open when I returned, and the unsettling feeling of being watched grew stronger every day. One evening, about a week after my visit to the mansion, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in front of the bathroom mirror, when I caught sight of something on my arm. It was faint at first, barely visible under the dim bathroom light, but as I leaned closer, I saw it clearly. A mark, small and circular, almost like a brand. It was on the inside of my left wrist, just below the palm, and it looked like it had been burned into my skin. Panic surged through me. I hadn't seen it before, and I had no idea how it got there. My mind raced, trying to remember if I had injured myself somehow, but nothing came to mind. I scrubbed at it, hoping it would wash off, but it didn't. It was permanent, embedded into my skin like some kind of twisted tattoo. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the mark, a million thoughts racing through my mind. How long had it been there? And why hadn't I noticed it before? I didn't sleep that night either. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that faceless figure, its cold, empty presence looming over me. And now, the mark on my wrist felt like a brand, a reminder that I had been chosen, marked by something I didn't understand. The next day, I decided to do some research. I spent hours online, searching for any information that might explain what was happening to me. But the more I looked, the more dead ends I hit. The dark web was a labyrinth of cryptic sites and dead links, and I found nothing that connected to Nocturne or the mark on my wrist. Frustrated and exhausted, I finally stumbled across a small, obscure forum dedicated to paranormal experiences. Most of the posts were the usual fare. Ghost sightings, UFO encounters, the kind of stuff you'd expect to find on a site like that. But then, I found a thread titled The Marked Ones. It was buried deep in the forum, with only a handful of replies, but something about the title caught my eye. I clicked on it, my heart pounding as I began to read. The original post was from someone claiming they had been marked after visiting a place that shouldn't exist. They described a similar experience, an old abandoned building, strange occurrences, and a mark that appeared on their skin afterward. The replies were mostly people dismissing it as a hoax or trying to offer explanations, but one reply stood out. "You've been chosen," it read. "The mark is a sign. It means they're watching you, waiting. You can't escape it. Once you're marked, it's only a matter of time before they come for you." My hands trembled as I read those words. The user who posted it had been inactive for years. Their account deleted shortly after the post was made, but the warning was clear. I was in danger. I closed the laptop and sat back, trying to steady my breathing. This was insane. None of this made any sense, but as much as I wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself it was all just some elaborate joke, I couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at my insides. That night, the nightmare started. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, with the images from my dreams still vivid in my mind. The mansion, the faceless figure, and a sense of something terrible looming just out of reach. The mark on my wrist throbbed with a dull ache, a constant reminder that I was no longer safe. One night, after another sleepless stretch of tossing and turning, I decided to confront my fear head on. I grabbed my phone and opened the map, scrolling back to the address that had led me to the mansion. My finger hovered over the screen, hesitating, but something inside me, whether it was desperation or defiance, pushed me to make the call. I needed to go back. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't live with this fear hanging over me, this constant dread of something unseen. I needed answers, and the only place I could think to find them was back at that mansion. So, in the dead of night, with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of impending doom, I got back into my car and drove towards the mansion. The roads were empty. The night eerily quiet, and as I got closer, a familiar sense of unease began to creep over me. When I arrived at the mansion, it was exactly as I had left it, dark, decaying, and foreboding. The gate creaked open with a groan, and I stepped through, the cold night air biting at my skin. This time, I wasn't as easily drawn in. I hesitated, standing there at the threshold, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But the mark on my wrist burned, a searing pain that seemed to compel me forward. I couldn't turn back now. The door to the mansion stood ajar, just as it had before, and I pushed it open with a trembling hand. The darkness inside was thick, suffocating, and the moment I stepped through the doorway, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread, of something watching me. I raised my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the same hallway I had walked down before. But this time, the house was different. The air was thicker, the walls seemed to close in on me, and the creaking of the floorboards was louder, more pronounced. It was like the mansion was alive, aware of my presence, and it didn't want me there. I made my way down the hallway, past the empty rooms, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew where I needed to go, the room at the end of the hall, the one with the strange symbols carved into the door, the one where I had seen that faceless figure. When I reached it, the door was already open, and inside, the old computer was still there, the screen flickering with static. The air in the room was freezing, my breath visible in the dim light, and as I stepped inside, I felt a sense of inevitability, like this was where I was meant to be all along. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room. The computer screen flickered, the static growing louder, and then words began to appear on the screen, just like before. "Welcome back." I could feel my heart pounding in my throat as I stared at the screen, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. The room was deathly silent, the only sound the low hum of the computer. I could feel the presence of something else in the room, something that hadn't revealed itself yet. Then more text appeared on the screen. "It's time to learn the truth." The screen flickered, and the static gave way to an image, a live feed of my own apartment, my living room to be exact. The camera seemed to be positioned in a corner of the room, and I could see everything: the couch, the coffee table, even the open laptop I had left behind. But then, something moved. A figure, standing just out of view, slowly stepped into the frame. My heart stopped as I recognized it. The faceless figure, the same one I had seen before, was now standing in my living room, in my home, and it was holding something. It was my phone. The figure slowly turned, as if looking directly at the camera, and then it raised the phone to its featureless face. The screen lit up, displaying a single message that made my blood run cold. "We're already inside." I stared at the screen, my body paralyzed with fear. The faceless figure was standing in my living room, holding my phone, and the message it displayed was like a death sentence. "We're already inside." The realization hit me like a freight train. This thing, whatever it was, had been in my apartment, moving around while I was none the wiser. My mind raced as I tried to piece together how it had gotten in, how it had found me, but there was no logical explanation. The walls of reality had been torn down, leaving me vulnerable to something far beyond my understanding. The screen flickered again, and the live feed of my apartment vanished, replaced by more text. "You can't run. You can't hide. It knows you." My hands shook as I backed away from the computer, the urge to flee overwhelming. But where could I go? This thing, this entity, was inside my home, inside my life, and there was no escaping it. The mark on my wrist throbbed painfully, as if reminding me of the bond that now linked us. The air in the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting until I could see my breath in front of me. The computer's screen began to glitch, the static warping into twisted images, flashes of my apartment, distorted faces, dark, empty eyes staring back at me. I had to get out of there. I had to find a way to break free from this nightmare. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut again, locking me inside. Panic surged through me, and I yanked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the walls themselves were alive, watching my every move. I was trapped, just like before, but this time, the sense of dread was even more suffocating. Then the room grew quiet, unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive, as if the very air is waiting for something to happen. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every beat a loud drum in the stillness. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I thought it was just the creaking of the old house, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere within the mansion. They were getting closer. I pressed myself against the door, my breath hitching as the footsteps continued, echoing through the empty halls. There was something wrong about the way they sounded, as if they didn't belong to a person, but to something else. Something that didn't walk the way we do. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest as I stood there, waiting for whatever was on the other side to reveal itself. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, the only sound in the otherwise dead silence. And then the doorknob began to turn. It moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if whatever was on the other side was toying with me. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe as the door creaked open, inch by inch. The darkness beyond it was impenetrable, a void that seemed to swallow the weak beam of my flashlight. For a moment, nothing happened. The door was open, but whatever had turned the knob remained hidden in the shadows. The silence stretched on, becoming unbearable, and I felt like I was going to scream, just to break it. And then, out of the darkness, a voice whispered my name. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was distorted, warped, as if it had been dragged through a broken speaker. The sound was almost inhuman, but there was a cold familiarity to it that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't know how, but I knew that this voice belonged to whatever had been following me, watching me, and now it was calling me out. "Come inside," it whispered again, the words lingering in the air like a foul stench. I shook my head, my voice caught in my throat. I didn't want to go in. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that voice as possible. But the mark on my wrist burned, sending searing pain up my arm, compelling me to move forward. My legs, as if controlled by something other than my own will, took a step toward the open door, then another. The darkness beyond the threshold seemed to ripple like a black, inky liquid, and I felt as though I was being drawn into it, swallowed by the void. I tried to fight it, tried to pull back, but my body refused to obey. The mark was now throbbing with unbearable heat, and I could feel something pulling me forward, dragging me into the abyss that waited beyond the door. As I crossed the threshold, the darkness closed in around me, suffocating, oppressive. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the temperature dropped even further, to the point where I could feel my skin beginning to numb. And then I was inside. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, plunging me into complete darkness. The last bit of light from the hallway was snuffed out, and I was left alone in the void, surrounded by nothing but cold, empty blackness. I tried to turn back, to reach for the door, but it was gone. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breathing, rapid and terrified. My flashlight flickered, the weak beam barely piercing the darkness, and I realized with growing horror that the room wasn't empty. I could feel them, cold, invisible hands brushing against my skin, ghostly fingers trailing down my arms, my back, my neck. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, reaching out to claim me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was trapped in my throat, choked off by the overwhelming fear that consumed me. And then, out of the darkness, they emerged. Figures, half-formed and shadowy, began to take shape around me. They were human in form, but distorted, twisted in ways that made my stomach turn. Their faces were blank, featureless, like the figure I had seen before, but I could feel their eyes on me, could sense their malevolent intent. They began to move closer, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. The closer they got, the more I could feel their cold presence, a deep chill that seeped into my bones. The voice whispered my name again, louder this time, more insistent. The figures closed in, their hands reaching out, and I felt a wave of cold panic wash over me. There was no escape, nowhere to run. I was trapped, surrounded by these things that had no right to exist. And then, just as their hands were about to touch me, everything stopped. The figures froze in place, the darkness receded slightly, and the voice spoke again, clear and commanding. "Do you want to know the truth?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move, but the voice didn't need an answer. It continued, the words drilling into my mind, filling me with a deep primal fear. "You've been chosen. You are marked, and there is no turning back. The game isn't over. It has only just begun." Suddenly, the darkness surged forward, the figures dissolving into it, and I felt myself being pulled down into the cold, empty void. The world around me twisted and warped, the sensation of falling, overwhelming my senses. And then just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. I was back in my apartment, sitting on my couch, drenched in sweat. My phone was in my hand, the screen displaying the same message. "We're already inside." But this time, something was different. The mark on my wrist was gone. It was as if it had never existed. I stared at my wrist, at the unmarked skin, disbelief and confusion swirling in my mind. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare so vivid that it had left me questioning reality. I didn't know what to think, what to believe anymore. But as I sat there, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered sanity, I heard a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible creak coming from the hallway. I turned my head slowly, every nerve in my body screaming in protest. And there it was. The door to my bedroom was ajar, and in the darkness beyond it, I could just make out the outline of a figure, tall, faceless, and waiting. The game wasn't over. It had followed me home. The figure stood motionless in the darkness of my hallway, its faceless head tilted slightly, as if observing me. My body was frozen in place, trapped between the suffocating fear that held me in its grip and the terrifying reality that the game had followed me into my home. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was as though I was staring into an abyss that was staring back, something so completely wrong it defied understanding. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the apartment and never look back. But deep down, I knew there was no escaping this. The mark may have vanished from my wrist, but the connection was still there, invisible, yet unbreakable. The game had marked me, and there was no way out. The air in the apartment felt heavy, thick with a presence that made it hard to breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound echoing in my ears like a drumbeat as I sat there, staring at the doorway. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its anticipation, a silent, chilling hunger that emanated from the darkness. Slowly, as if waking from a trance, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt weak, trembling with each step as I moved toward the door. Every inch closer made the air colder, more oppressive, as if the figure was drawing the very warmth from the room. But I had to confront it. I couldn't live like this, trapped in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder for something that was always there. I stepped into the hallway, the light from the living room fading behind me, swallowed by the darkness. The figure remained still, its presence more menacing now that I was only a few feet away. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the light switch on the wall, desperate for anything that might dispel the nightmare unfolding in front of me. But when I flipped the switch, nothing happened. The light stayed off, leaving me in the shadowy gloom with the faceless entity. My heart sank as I realized that this was no ordinary darkness. This was something else, something beyond the natural world, and it obeyed different rules. The figure took a step forward. I stumbled back, my hand hitting the wall as I tried to keep my balance. The temperature dropped even further, the cold seeping into my bones, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. This was it. This was the end game, and I had no idea what was coming next. The figure took another step, and then another, closing the distance between us with slow, deliberate movements. It was like watching a predator stalking its prey, each step calculated to instill the maximum amount of fear. And it was working. My mind raced, searching for something, anything that could stop this. But there was nothing. I was powerless, completely at the mercy of whatever force had taken hold of my life. And then the figure spoke, but it wasn't a voice. Not really. It was more like a thought, a presence that echoed inside my mind, filling it with words that weren't my own. You cannot escape. The words reverberated through my skull, a statement of absolute certainty. There was no malice, no anger, just cold, unyielding truth. The figure stopped in front of me, so close that I could feel the chill radiating from its body, or lack thereof. You are part of the game now. You always were. I couldn't respond, couldn't even think straight. The presence in my mind was overwhelming, drowning out my own thoughts, leaving me with nothing but the knowledge that this was inevitable. The figure had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Now it had. The darkness around us seemed to pulse, growing thicker, more tangible, as if it was alive, breathing. The walls of the hallway began to warp, the edges blurring as reality itself started to twist and bend. I felt like I was being pulled into a vortex, sucked into the void that surrounded the figure. You have been chosen, the presence in my mind whispered. There is no escape. There is no turning back. The walls of the hallway dissolved, melting into the darkness until there was nothing left but the void. The floor beneath me vanished, and I felt myself falling, weightless, into the endless black. The cold was all-consuming now, wrapping around me like a shroud, suffocating and inescapable. And then I was no longer in my apartment. I was back in the mansion. The transition was so sudden, so jarring, that it took a moment for my brain to catch up. One moment, I had been falling through the void, and the next, I was standing in the very room where it had all begun. The room with the old computer, the flickering screen, and the oppressive darkness that had seemed to follow me everywhere. But this time, there was something different. The computer screen wasn't flickering with static. Instead, it displayed a message, clear and bold, in a familiar, cold font. Welcome to the end. I took a shaky step forward, drawn to the screen despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The room felt even colder than before, the shadows deeper, more malevolent. I could sense them moving, shifting just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for me to make a mistake. The screen flickered and the image changed. It was my apartment again, but this time there was no figure. Everything looked normal, untouched, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. The mark was back. It was on the wall, scrawled in a dark, almost black substance, a perfect replica of the symbol that had appeared on my wrist. The sight of it filled me with a deep, primal terror, a fear that went beyond reason or understanding. It was a sign, a declaration that the game wasn't over, that it would never be over. The screen flickered again, and more text appeared. You belong to us now. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The realization that I had been marked, chosen for something beyond my control, was more than I could bear. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I was powerless, trapped in this nightmare that had no end. The computer screen went dark, plunging the room into complete blackness. I could hear the whispers again, low and insistent, surrounding me from all sides. They were speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. They were claiming me. I felt the darkness closing in, the cold hands reaching out to pull me into the void, and I knew that this was it. There was no escape, no waking up from this nightmare. I was theirs, part of the game, and the game never ended. As the darkness enveloped me, I felt a final, fleeting sense of resignation. This was my fate, and there was no fighting it. The last thing I saw before the void consumed me completely was the mark, glowing faintly in the darkness, a symbol of my eternal imprisonment. And then, there was nothing, just the endless void, and the game that would never end. I joined a red room on the dark web. You won't believe what I found. So I'm not exactly proud of this, but it all started out of boredom. You know those late nights when you're just lying in bed, scrolling through Reddit or YouTube, and nothing really holds your attention. That's where I was. It was one of those nights where you're not sure if you should try to sleep or just give up and accept that you'll be a zombie tomorrow. So instead of being sensible, I decided to dive into the dark web. I know, classic horror story move. But I wasn't looking for anything crazy, just the usual urban legends or conspiracy theories that you hear about on the surface web. I wasn't planning to find anything genuinely creepy or even illegal. Honestly, I just thought it would be a thrill to see what was out there. I'd been on the dark web before, nothing major. Just the typical stuff you might imagine. Forums about conspiracies, some sketchy-looking shops selling questionable goods, even some old inactive chat rooms that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. But it was all just digital dust, you know. Nothing that really set off alarm bells. Until I came across a thread on an anonymous forum titled The Red Room Experience. Now, if you've been around the internet long enough, you've probably heard of red rooms. If not, they're supposedly live streams where people pay to watch terrible things happen to other people. I always thought it was just an urban legend, like something out of a horror movie that people use to scare each other. But this thread was different. It wasn't just people talking about the concept. It was filled with people who claimed to have actually been in one. There were dozens of posts from different users, each describing their experiences in hauntingly realistic detail. Most were skeptical or just trolls, but one comment caught my eye. It was from a user named Oblivion, and their post wasn't long, just a few lines really. But what they said sent a chill down my spine. Red rooms are real. I joined one. What I saw still haunts me. If you want to know more, PM me, but only if you're serious. This isn't a game. I hesitated. There was something about the way they phrased it that felt off. Like this person wasn't trying to mess with people for laughs. They genuinely seemed disturbed. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just an idiot. But I decided to shoot them a message. I kept it short and to the point. Something like, "Hey, I saw your post. I'm curious. What did you see?" I didn't expect to hear back, but about 10 minutes later, my screen flashed with a notification. Oblivion had replied. The message was short, just an invitation link. No explanation, no warning, just a link. It didn't look like a regular URL either. It was one of those weird long strings of random letters and numbers you only see on the dark web. There was also a small note below it. Join if you dare, but know that once you see it, you can't unsee it. My heart started pounding in my chest. I should have closed my laptop right there and gone to bed. But instead, I stared at that link for what felt like hours, debating whether I should click it. Something inside me, some twisted sense of curiosity, took over. I copied the link and pasted it into my Tor browser, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach as I hit enter. The page took a while to load, which I've learned is normal on the dark web. When it finally loaded, it wasn't what I expected. There were no flashy graphics or disturbing images, just a plain black background with a single red button in the center of the screen. The button had the word "Enter" in bold white letters. At this point, every instinct I had was telling me to close the tab and pretend this never happened, but I felt like I'd already gone too far to back out now. So I took a deep breath, moved my cursor over the button, and clicked. The screen flickered for a moment, and then I was taken to a new page. This one was even simpler, just a blank white screen with a small chat box in the lower right corner. I was just about to question what I was looking at when a message popped up in the chat. "Welcome. You are now entering the Red Room. Please wait while we verify your connection." My heart was racing. I could hear it pounding in my ears, drowning out the silence of my room. My screen went dark for a few seconds. Then another message appeared. "Verification complete. Please make sure your webcam is on." My breath caught in my throat. Webcam? I hadn't turned mine on, and there was no way I was going to. Before I could react, my webcam light flickered on by itself. I stared at the small dot of light, frozen in shock. How had they accessed it? I hadn't given any permissions, and then the screen changed again. This time, it wasn't a chat box or text. It was a live video feed. I was looking at myself. My own face stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. It was like staring into a mirror, but with a slight delay, as if the feed wasn't quite live. My bedroom looked the same, dimly lit by my laptop screen. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This was real. Someone was watching me. Just as I was about to slam my laptop shut, another window opened beside the video feed. It was another live feed, this time of a dark, windowless room. A figure was sitting in the center, their back turned to the camera, head slightly bowed. The room was lit by a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge the camera, just sat there, motionless. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The chat box popped up again with a new message. Enjoy the show. The figure on the screen finally moved, slowly turning their head toward the camera. But before I could get a clear look at their face, the feed cut to black, and all that was left on the screen was a single blinking cursor. For what felt like an eternity, I just sat there, staring at that blinking cursor on the screen. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The room was quiet, but it didn't feel like I was alone anymore. It was like the air had shifted, grown heavier, more oppressive. I could still feel the weight of those unseen eyes on me, like someone was standing just out of sight, watching my every move. I should have shut it all down right then. I should have unplugged my laptop, tossed it in the closet, and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I just kept staring at that empty screen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After what felt like an eternity, the chat box flickered to life again. This time, there was no cryptic message, no ominous warning, just one word: wait. And so I waited. I don't know how long I sat there, my heart thudding in my chest, my eyes fixed on the screen. Minutes passed, maybe even an hour. My room seemed to get darker and colder, though I hadn't moved a muscle. It was like time itself had warped, stretching out the seconds until they felt unbearable. Finally, the screen flickered, and a new video feed appeared. This time, it wasn't my own face staring back at me. It was that same dark, windowless room from before, but now it was empty. The figure that had been sitting there was gone, leaving nothing but that bare concrete floor and the dim bulb swinging slightly overhead. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the screen as I squinted to make out any details. The room looked like some kind of basement or cellar, the walls lined with cracks and patches of mold. There were no windows, no furniture, just that single bulb casting its sickly yellow light. But something about the room felt wrong, like it was a place that had seen things that should never be spoken of. The chat box lit up again, breaking the silence. "Are you ready?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. I wasn't ready, not in the slightest, but I felt compelled to respond, like something was forcing my hand. I typed out a shaky yes and hit enter. The screen flickered once more, and then the camera feed shifted. The view panned slowly across the room, revealing more of that bleak concrete space. As it moved, I noticed something strange. Dark stains on the floor, like someone had tried to clean up a spill, but hadn't quite managed to erase it. The stains trailed off toward the far corner of the room, where something large and covered in a tarp was lying on the floor. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear myself think. The camera zoomed in on the tarp, and that's when I saw it. A hand, pale and lifeless, poking out from beneath the fabric. It was small, like a child's hand. The chat box dinged again, and this time, I jumped so hard, I nearly knocked my laptop off my desk. "Do you want to see more?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hands were trembling too much to type anything, but it didn't seem to matter. The feed continued without my input. The camera zoomed out slightly, then panned over to the far wall, where a large metal door was set into the concrete. It looked out of place, like it belonged in some kind of industrial facility rather than a basement. The camera lingered on the door for a moment, and then I saw it. Deep scratches in the metal, like someone had clawed at it desperately, trying to escape. The top in the corner suddenly shifted, ever so slightly. It was just a small movement, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I watched, frozen, as the top began to slowly rise, revealing more of the pale figure beneath. And then, just as I thought I might see the face of whatever was under there, the screen cut to black again. I gasped, my chest heaving with the effort of trying to catch my breath. My whole body was shaking, my fingers white-knuckled as they gripped the edge of my desk. I felt sick to my stomach, like I was going to throw up at any moment. This wasn't just some horror show. This felt real. Too real. The chat box appeared again, but this time the message was different. It was a set of instructions. Stay calm. You have been chosen to be a watcher. Do not attempt to leave the room. Do not turn off your device. You will be contacted again soon. My mind was reeling. A watcher? What the hell did that mean? My thoughts were spiraling, a million questions flooding my brain all at once. What had I gotten myself into? Was this some kind of sick game? And why had they chosen me? As I sat there, trying to make sense of it all, I became aware of a new sound, something faint, just on the edge of hearing. I strained to listen, but it was so quiet that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, almost like a heartbeat pulsing steadily through my speakers. It was subtle, but the more I focused on it, the louder it seemed to get, until it was filling the room, reverberating off the walls. And then, something happened that made my blood run cold. My phone, which had been lying face down on my desk, buzzed with a notification. I picked it up, hands shaking, and looked at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message was simple, just a few words, but they sent a shock of terror straight through me. We are watching you. I dropped the phone like it had burned me, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign that someone was there, but everything looked the same. Just me, alone in my darkened room, with nothing but the glow of my laptop screen to keep me company. The low thumping sound continued, growing louder, more insistent. I felt like it was coming from inside my head, making it impossible to think straight. Panic was creeping up my spine, turning my thoughts into a tangled mess of fear and confusion. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the thumping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I stared at the screen, half expecting something else to happen, but the screen remained black, the chat box empty. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there, but I was too terrified to move. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out, to run as far away as I could, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by fear. That's when my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what the message said, but some part of me, the same part that had led me down this path in the first place, couldn't resist. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and unlocked the screen. This time, the message was different. It wasn't a threat or a warning. It was an address in my city. My heart skipped a beat as I read it over and over again, my mind struggling to comprehend what it meant. But deep down, I already knew. This wasn't just a random location. This was a place they wanted me to go. And I had the sickening feeling that I was about to find out why. I sat there, staring at the address on my phone, the screen glowing ominously in the dark. My mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room and pretend I'd never seen it. But another part, a darker, more curious part, felt compelled to know more. Why had they sent me this? What was at that address? And why did it feel like I had no choice but to go? I tried to shake the feeling, to convince myself that this was just some elaborate prank, but the fear gnawing at the edges of my thoughts wouldn't let me. Whoever was behind this, they weren't playing games. They had control over my laptop, my webcam, even my phone. And now they wanted me to go somewhere, alone, in the middle of the night. I knew it was a bad idea. Every horror movie cliche screamed at me to stay put, to lock my doors and call the police. But I couldn't. Not because I didn't want to, but because I felt like they wouldn't let me. It was as if an invisible thread was pulling me toward that address, and I was too scared to resist. I grabbed my jacket, slipping it on with trembling hands. My legs felt like jelly as I stood up, my entire body on edge, expecting something, anything, to happen the moment I moved. But nothing did. The room was silent. The only sound, the faint hum of my laptop fan. I stuffed my phone into my pocket and grabbed my keys. As I turned to leave, my gaze fell on my laptop screen. One last time. It was still blank, that ominous emptiness filling the room with a sense of dread. The thought of leaving it on, still connected to whatever this was, made my skin crawl, but I was too afraid to shut it off. I didn't want to provoke them. Taking a deep breath, I walked out of my apartment and into the cool night air. The city was quiet, the streets empty, which only added to the eerie atmosphere. The address was a few miles away, in a part of town I didn't usually go to. It wasn't exactly a bad neighborhood, but it had a reputation for being odd. A place where people tended to mind their own business and look the other way when something didn't seem right. I decided to drive, hoping that being in my car would offer some small sense of security. But as I got in and started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something sitting in the back seat, but there was nothing, just the empty street behind me. The drive felt like it took forever, even though it was only about 15 minutes. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I kept replaying everything that had happened in my mind, trying to make sense of it all, but the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. What kind of sick game was this? And why had I been dragged into it? When I finally reached the address, my heart sank. The building was old, crumbling at the edges, with boarded-up windows and graffiti scrawled across the walls. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the kind of place where bad things happened, things that were better left alone. The street was empty, eerily quiet. The only light came from a flickering street lamp a few yards away, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. I parked a little way down the street, not wanting to draw attention to myself. But who was I kidding? I was the only one there. I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the building, trying to summon the courage to get out. The address matched perfectly. This was the place they wanted me to go. But why? What was inside? I reached for my phone, my hands shaking as I unlocked it. Maybe there was some new message, some clue as to what I was supposed to do next. But there was nothing, just that same ominous address taunting me. I knew I had to go in. I didn't know what would happen if I didn't, but I had the sickening feeling that ignoring it wasn't an option. So, against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I got out of the car and walked toward the building. The closer I got, the more I noticed the little details, the way the bricks seemed to sag under the weight of time, the smell of damp and decay that hung in the air, the way the boards over the windows were nailed in haphazardly, as if someone had been in a rush to seal something inside, or maybe to keep something out. When I reached the door, I hesitated. It was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges, as if it had been forced open. I pushed it gently, and it creaked ominously as it swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow hallway. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my stomach turn. The hallway was lit only by the faint glow of moonlight seeping in through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I took a few tentative steps inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. As I walked deeper into the building, the sounds of the outside world faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the building was a living thing, breathing, shifting around me, trying to confuse me, to trap me. Finally, I reached the end of the hallway, where a heavy metal door stood ajar, much like the one in the video. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud I could hear it echoing in the empty space. I reached out, hesitating for just a moment before pushing the door open. The room beyond was just as I'd seen in the video. A cold, empty basement with bare concrete walls and a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. But it was what was in the center of the room that made my blood run cold. The top was still there, the same one from the video, covering something large and misshapen. But now it was stained, dark patches seeping through the fabric, as if something had bled out underneath it. I wanted to turn and run, to get out of that place and never look back, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were glued to the floor, my eyes fixed on that top, my body refusing to obey my desperate urge to leave. And then the top moved. It was subtle at first, just a small shift, as if whatever was underneath was trying to break free. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it rise and fall, as though something was breathing, something alive, or worse, something that had been alive. The top slid off slowly, revealing what lay beneath, and what I saw there. I can't even begin to describe the horror that filled me at that moment. It was wrong, so impossibly wrong that my mind refused to fully comprehend it. All I know is that it was something that should not have existed, something twisted and unnatural, something that had no place in this world. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but no sound came out. My body was frozen in place, my mind reeling, as that thing, whatever it was, began to stir. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it was waking up from a long slumber. I could see flashes of pale skin, slick with something dark and wet, and a face, or what was left of a face, that twisted into an expression of agony and rage. And then the thing looked at me. Its eyes were empty, hollow, like black pits that seemed to suck in all the light from the room. But even without pupils, I could feel its gaze piercing through me, filling me with a terror so intense that I thought I might pass out. That's when I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, coming from somewhere deep inside the room, or maybe from inside my own head. A voice that said only one thing: "Welcome, Watcher." I stumbled backward, finally breaking free from the paralyzing fear that had gripped me. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away. The hallway twisted and turned, the walls closing in around me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I burst through the front door and into the night, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, throwing myself inside and locking the doors behind me. But even then, as I sped away from that place, tires screeching on the asphalt, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, that whatever had been in that room was still with me, watching, waiting. And as I drove into the night, my phone buzzed again with a new message. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I glanced down, my hands trembling as I unlocked the screen. The message was simple, just 2 words: "See you." The drive home felt like a blur, my thoughts spinning in a chaotic whirlwind of fear and disbelief. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing from the basement staring back at me from the back seat. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the darkness pressing in on all sides. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. Who had sent me that address? Why had I been chosen? And most terrifying of all, what was that thing I had seen under the tarp? It wasn't just fear that gripped me now, but a deep, gnawing dread, like something had latched onto me and wasn't going to let go. I pulled into my apartment complex, the familiar sight of the building doing little to calm my nerves. The shadows seemed longer, the night darker, as if something was waiting just out of sight. I parked the car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I wanted to believe that once I was inside, I'd be safe. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it. That same sense of being watched, like invisible eyes were following my every move. I hurried up the stairs to my apartment, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath. I finally reached my door, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it and slipped inside. I locked it behind me, throwing every bolt, sliding every chain. But even as I did, I knew it was pointless. Locks couldn't keep out what was already inside. I stood in the middle of my living room, trying to catch my breath, trying to think. My mind was a mess, tangled with fear and confusion. My phone buzzed in my pocket again, but I didn't want to look. I couldn't. I was too scared of what I might see. But I had to know. With a sense of dread, I pulled out my phone and unlocked it. Another message from the same unknown number. This time, it was an image. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest as I opened it. The image was dark and grainy, but I could make out the faint outline of a room. My room. The angle was low, as if the photo had been taken from the floor, and it was pointed directly at my bed. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. This photo had been taken in my apartment while I was gone. My first instinct was to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. But where would I go? Whatever this was, it wasn't something I could escape by simply leaving. It was tied to me now, like a curse, something I couldn't shake no matter how far I went. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. I could feel the darkness pressing in, suffocating me as if the very air was poisoned. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next, but nothing made sense. I was out of my depth, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Movement, just a flicker of shadow, but enough to make my heart stop. I turned, my eyes darting to the corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest. Something was there. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but then it moved again. A slow, deliberate shift in the darkness, like something was crawling out from the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, frozen with fear. And then I saw it. Those eyes, the same hollow, empty eyes that had stared at me from the basement, now staring at me from the corner of my own living room. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in its gaze. The figure in the shadows began to emerge slowly, as if savoring my terror. It was hunched over, its limbs long and twisted, its skin pale and slick. It moved with an unnatural grace, each step slow and deliberate, as if it was taking its time, enjoying the fear it was causing. My body finally responded, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I tried to get away. But there was nowhere to go. The apartment was small, and the thing was blocking the only exit. I was trapped. The figure continued to advance, its eyes never leaving mine. As it drew closer, I could see it more clearly. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human face, features distorted and wrong, like a nightmare brought to life. And its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, as if it was relishing my fear. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The thing stopped a few feet away from me. Its head tilted slightly as it studied me. It didn't speak, but I could feel its thoughts, its intentions. It was toying with me, playing a sick game that only it knew the rules to. The air around me grew colder, the shadows deepening, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around us. I could feel something in the air, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for this moment for a long time. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. The words weren't in any language I knew, but I understood them all the same. They echoed in my mind, reverberating through my very soul, filling me with a dread so profound that I thought I might go mad. "You are the Watcher now." With those words, everything changed. The room seemed to tilt, the walls bending and warping around me. I could feel a pressure in my head, like something was trying to push its way in, to take control. I fought against it, but it was too strong, too overwhelming. Images flooded my mind, terrible, twisted images of pain and suffering, of things that no human should ever witness. I could feel them burrowing into my thoughts, taking root, like a poison that couldn't be purged. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me, and I fell to my knees, clutching my head in agony. The thing in front of me didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting, as if it knew what was happening, as if it had seen this all before. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. The room snapped back into focus, the shadows retreating to their corners. I was left panting, my body trembling, my mind reeling from the experience. But the thing was still there, watching me with those hollow eyes. Slowly, it began to retreat, slipping back into the shadows from where it came. But before it disappeared completely, it paused, its gaze locking onto mine one last time. And then, with a final, twisted grin, it vanished into the darkness. I was left alone, the silence in the room deafening. My mind was a mess, my thoughts jumbled and confused. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Whatever had happened to me, whatever that thing had done, it had changed something inside me. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was part of this now, connected to something far larger and more terrifying than I could ever have imagined. And as I sat there in the darkness, my phone buzzed once more. I didn't need to look at it to know what it said. I could already feel the words burning in my mind, searing themselves into my thoughts. Welcome to the Red Room. I don't know how long I sat there, slumped against the wall in the cold, dark silence of my apartment. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning, slipping through my fingers like sand. All I knew was that I felt empty, hollowed out, like something vital had been ripped away, leaving nothing but a void where my sense of self used to be. The apartment was dead silent, but it didn't feel like I was alone. The darkness had taken on a weight of its own, pressing in on me from all sides. Every shadow seemed to crawl with unseen eyes, every flicker of light, a reminder that something unnatural was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. And then, the silence was shattered by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the room. I couldn't pinpoint the source at first. It was too soft, too subtle, like a drip of water echoing in a cavern. But the more I listened, the louder it became, until it was all I could hear, filling the room with its relentless, monotonous beat. Tap, tap, tap. I forced myself to move, my muscles stiff and uncooperative, as I slowly pushed myself up from the floor. My whole body was trembling, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the room for the source of the sound. My eyes were drawn to my laptop, still sitting open on the coffee table where I'd left it. The screen was black, but the tapping was definitely coming from it. With a sense of dread curling in the pit of my stomach, I reached out and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, and I immediately wished I hadn't touched it. The video feed was back, but this time, it wasn't showing my room. It was showing something else, another dark, empty space, much like the basement I'd seen earlier. The walls were the same cold, bare concrete, the single bulb overhead casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things, but there was no top, no figure lurking in the shadows. The room was empty, or so I thought. The camera slowly panned to the left, and my breath caught in my throat. There, in the far corner of the room, was a chair. It was an old, rusted thing, bolted to the floor like some kind of interrogation device. And sitting in that chair was me. I felt my heart lurch in my chest as I stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure in the chair was unmistakably me. Same clothes, same hair, same haunted expression on my face. But it couldn't be. I was here, in my apartment. This had to be some kind of trick, some sick, twisted game. But the figure in the chair was moving. Its head was slumped forward, hair falling across its face. But it was breathing, shallow and ragged. Slowly, almost painfully, it lifted its head and looked directly at the camera, directly at me. Its eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness, just like the creature I'd seen in the shadows. But they weren't the eyes of a monster. They were my eyes, twisted and wrung, reflecting back at me the terror and despair that had taken root deep inside me. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling as the video feed continued. The figure in the chair didn't move again. It just stared, unblinking, as if waiting for something, waiting for me. Then without warning, the screen flickered and a new image appeared. This one was grainy and distorted, the colors bleeding together like a corrupted file. But I could still make out what it was showing. It was my apartment, my living room, right now. The angle was wrong, though. It wasn't being filmed from any normal perspective. It was low, like before, but much closer to the floor, like someone or something was crawling toward me. The camera panned slowly, inching closer, until it was almost at my feet. I could see myself on the screen, standing there, pale and trembling, my eyes wide with terror as I stared down at the camera. But there was nothing there. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The camera wasn't showing a feed from some other place. It was showing this moment, right now, but from a perspective that shouldn't exist. And then, just as I was trying to make sense of it all, the camera feed jerked violently, like something had grabbed it. The screen filled with static, flickering wildly, and then a new image appeared, one that made my blood turn to ice. It was my face, staring directly into the camera. But this time, it wasn't just a reflection. It was me, or at least something that looked like me, twisted into a grotesque parody of my own features. The skin was pale and slick, the eyes hollow and black, and that mouth, a horrible, gaping grin that stretched too wide, like it was trying to swallow the screen whole. The thing on the screen opened its mouth, and the sound that came out was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was a low, guttural growl, layered with whispers and screams, all jumbled together in a chaotic chorus of madness. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a sound that no human throat could produce. And then, in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it spoke. "We are one now." The screen went black. I stood there gasping for breath, my mind barely able to process what had just happened. The room was spinning, the shadows pressing in from all sides, as if the walls were closing in on me. I could still hear that voice in my head, echoing through my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before I finally moved. My body felt like it was moving on autopilot, disconnected from my mind. I stumbled toward the door, my hand reaching for the doorknob, desperate to get out of that apartment, to escape whatever nightmare I had been pulled into. But as my fingers closed around the cold metal of the doorknob, I stopped. Something was wrong. My hand didn't feel right. It was slick, wet, like it was coated in something sticky. I looked down and my breath caught in my throat. My hand was covered in blood. The sight of it sent a shock of terror through me, and I jerked my hand back, staring at it in horror. The blood was fresh, still warm, dripping down my fingers and pooling on the floor. But I wasn't hurt. I hadn't been injured. The blood wasn't mine. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest as I looked back at the laptop screen. It was on again, the blackness replaced by a new image. The same basement room, same chair, but this time there was someone else in the chair. It was a person, a man, maybe in his 40s, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with fear as he struggled against the restraints. His clothes were torn, his skin bruised and bloodied, and his face was twisted in agony. And then I saw it, the knife. It was in my hand, slick with blood, the same blood that was now staining my skin. I stared at the screen, unable to believe what I was seeing. The camera was panning down, showing the blood-soaked blade, the fresh cuts on the man's body, the terror in his eyes. I dropped the knife, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I stumbled back from the screen. My mind was screaming, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it was impossible. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But it was. It was all too real. And the worst part was, I knew that I had done it. Somehow, some way, I had been a part of this. I had become the watcher, just as they had said, and now I was part of something far darker and more twisted than I could ever have imagined. The screen flickered again, the image shifting to another room, another victim, and then another, and another, each one more horrifying than the last. And in every scene, there was the knife, slick with blood, and my hand, holding it steady as I carried out the terrible acts that I couldn't remember, that I couldn't have done, but I had done them. I was certain of it, and now there was no going back. The final image on the screen was of me, standing in that same basement, the knife in my hand, the same twisted grin on my face that I had seen in the earlier video. And as I stared at it, something in my mind snapped. I turned off the laptop, the screen going black once more, plunging the room into darkness. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands still shaking. I knew what I had to do. There was only one way out of this nightmare, only one way to break the curse. I grabbed the laptop, yanking the cord from the wall, and walked out of the apartment. I didn't look back as I left, the door slamming shut behind me. I got into my car, throwing the laptop onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. The drive was a blur, my mind numb to everything around me. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was far away from that place, from the horrors I had witnessed.